The Niralamba Upanishad is one of the most important Upanishads which is not studied as much as it should be. It contains simple and direct wisdom that is applicable to all. In fact, the Upanishad declares that learning it alone leads one to liberation from the cycle of birth and death. The word Niralamba translates to standing alone or standing without support. Before we go into the content of the Niralamba Upanishad, we will have to understand a little bit about the classification of Upanishads. In fact, this categorization of Upanishads appear in the Muktika Upanishad, which contains a conversation between Sri Ram and Hanuman, where Lord Ram tells Hanuman about the Upanishadic texts that would lead one towards liberation. Lord Ram talks about the different types of liberation and says that in order to attain liberation, the Mandukya Upanishad alone is enough. If knowledge is not got from it, then go study the 10 Upanishads, he says. These were called the Mukhya Upanishads. Lord Ram also goes on to say that if desiring moksha without the body, liberation without the body, one can read 108 Upanishads, including the 10 Mukhya Upanishads. The Niralamba Upanishad is number 34 in this list of Upanishads. It is essential to understand that Mukhya means important, but that's not the only significance of the Mukhya Upanishads. If you read some of the Mukhya Upanishads, like the Chandogya Upanishad or the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, you will find that some of these are meant for an initiated audience. They might contain transcendental wisdom, like the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where we will need to understand certain symbolisms to appreciate the wisdom. For example, you might need to know what the real symbolisms of words like go and ashwa are before understanding the deep philosophies in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Now, some of the Mukhya Upanishads might be less transcendental, say like the Chandogya Upanishad, but as we read those, we still find that there are a lot of allegories and symbolisms in these. Many great Vedantin saints also wrote commentaries on these. Apart from the Mukhya Upanishad, scholars have classified the rest of these Upanishads into many buckets, many categories. Saamanya Upanishads are those Upanishads that are applicable for a general audience. It is inclusive, meaning that you do not need to be initiated into understanding certain symbolisms in order to appreciate its wisdom. The Niralamba Upanishad is a Saamanya Upanishad, applicable to the general audience. It is very direct and filled with easily accessible Dharmic wisdom. The Upanishad is in the form of a series of questions and then answers to these questions. So we start with the first 3 questions in the Upanishad. These are Kim Brahma, Ka Ishvara, Ko Jiva. What is the Brahman, the ultimate reality? Who is Ishvara, who is God or a qualified controller? Who is the individual soul, the Jiva? Now, these 3 questions alone should give you an idea of how direct this Upanishad is. The text answers the first question, what is Brahman? The Brahman appears to us as the intellect, ego, the elements, the universe itself made out of actions and knowledge, but although the Brahman appears as all this, it is in essence, according to the Upanishad, Anadi Anantam, Suddham Sivam, Shantam Nirgunam, without beginning and end, pure, auspicious, and unqualified, without any attributes or qualities. Now then comes the next question. Who is Ishvara? Who is this God? There is a difference even in the words used. Kim Brahma, what is the Brahman? And Ka Ishvara, who is the Ishvara, who is the God? The Upanishad here says that the infinite, all-pervading Brahman, through its powers of Prakriti, the creative aspect, created the worlds and enters into these worlds and all the beings in it as the inner controller. This aspect of Brahman is Ishvara. As we discussed earlier, this entire creative experience is the dance of delight of the Brahman when it manifests itself as the universe. The question that follows is, Who is Jiva, the individual soul? The answer given is very interesting. The individual soul, confused by illusion, thinks I am this body with a certain name and form. The Upanishad says that the illusion is there even in the highest beings, which take on the names and forms of Brahma, Vishnu, Ishvara, etc. Now, the word used here is mithya. Maya and mithya can be translated literally as illusion, but that does not give the entire picture of what Maya and mithya are. Maya is not just illusion, but also the aspect of projection of the Brahman into the material universe. We will go through this in detail in another video. Even though certain aspects of the Brahman might be more qualified than the other in terms of realization and power, all of it is Brahman. Even in the Bhakti Marga, the devotional branch of Hinduism, we can see Puranic stories that affirm this. The next question posed by the Upanishad is this: what is Prakriti, the material, the nature of matter? Prakriti, the Upanishad says, is the power and potential of the Brahman, which can manifest this great universes full of variety. It is the creative aspect of the Brahman. The next question that the Upanishad asks: what is Paramatma, the supreme oversoul? Now, sometimes in Dharmic texts, particularly in Hindu Dharmic texts, we have distinctions between Jiva, Brahman, Ishvara, Paramatma, and so on. The Upanishad tries to clarify all these. The Upanishad declares that the Brahman alone is the Paramatma. The next few questions are posed. Who is Brahma? Who is Vishnu? Who is Rudra? Who is Indra? Who is Yama? Who is Surya, the sun? Who is Chandra, the moon? Who are the Devas, demigods? Who are the Asuras? Who are the Pisasas, the evil spirits? Who are men? Who are women? What are animals? What is inanimate? Who are the Brahmanas and the others? Now, the Upanishad answers all these questions in one sentence full of wisdom. Sarvam khalvidam Brahma neha nanasti kinchana. All these are Brahman. There is no plurality here. Even though we see a difference in the material world, all that exists is the Brahman. You can see this stated in many other Upanishads as well, but here all the questions are direct and to the point. The next question is about society. Ka jatihi. What is Jati? It says. Jati can be understood as tribe or caste or family. Now, trying to debate its actual meaning is a longer conversation, but the Upanishad actually gives a simple and direct reply that helps us avoid all these dissections. Jati is not due to one's skin, nor due to one's blood, nor due to one's flesh, nor to one's bones. The self has no jati. The self has no caste. Caste is a result of inclinations and actions. At best, this concept of jati or varna would be the soul's actions and inclinations in the material world. The next two questions posed in the Upanishads are heavy as well. What is karma and what is akarma? Karma translates to actions and akarma is non-action. The answer that the Upanishad gives is this. When any action is performed keeping the self in the center, believing that I am the doer, karma gets cultivated. This karma is carried over to future births. These can be any actions, good or bad, rituals, acts of charity, penance, austerities, etc. Now, it should be understood from this answer that anything done with the I in mind yields karma that gets attached to the doer. Righteous actions might yield material benefits for the doer, which is punya karma. Unrighteous actions lead to papa karma, bad karma. There is a term for this called vikarma. This again affects the doer of these actions, the illusory individual soul, in future births. The Upanishad states that Akarma is the performance of any action without the desire for the results or the fruits of the action. By not being attached to the fruits, one becomes free of karma. Simply put, if you desire the fruits of an action, that means one is still attached in a way to a material desire. Akarma leads to desirelessness of anything material, and this leads towards liberation. These concepts we will take up in a more detailed discussion. Now, the Upanishad poses the next two questions. What is jnana, knowledge? And what is ajnana, ignorance? The Upanishad says that jnana is the realization that all that exists is the Brahman, the supreme oversoul, the ultimate reality, the infinite consciousness. True knowledge is the direct perception of the Brahman. Ignorance, ajnana, is the illusory knowledge that emphasizes the material world as all that there is. Here, the Upanishad gives the example of mistaking the rope for a snake. This is a classic Advaitic example. Just as in the dark, one could mistake a rope for a snake, so also we attribute all these bodily labels and these material labels to the soul. The Upanishad says that we get too attached to these vehicles of the soul and not the essence of the Supreme Absolute that permeates everything. This illusory perception of plurality and artificial divisions will cause ignorance. Moving on to the next question. What is sukha, happiness, and what is dukkha, suffering? Knowing one's natural state. Knowledge that one is part of the Supreme Absolute is true happiness. The word used here is Satchidananda. Sat is true essence of being. Chit is consciousness, the Chit aspect of the Brahman. Ananda is happiness. So Sat Chit Ananda is the state of bliss of pure consciousness. Pain and suffering, dukkha, on the other hand, is just the thought of material objects of worldly existence. What this means is that if you think of and are attached to the objects in the material world, this leads to suffering. The next two questions are on heaven and hell. What is heaven and what is hell? The Upanishad states that union with the pure and true essence of being is heaven. What is hell? Hell, according to the Upanishad, is union with sense objects, with the material realms, and union with those who in ignorance pursue only the material. The next two questions are, what is bandha and what is moksha? Bandha translates to locks and knots, any of these ties that hold us to samsara. Bandha literally means bondage. The response is rather detailed. The Upanishad says that bondage is anything that causes one to decide to take birth in the material world again. If one thinks there is a need to stay in this world because of relations like father, mother, wife, children, brother, sister, home, land, anything, that causes bondage. The Upanishad goes on to say this: any identifications with labels like caste, actions such as worshipping out of desires is bondage. Ego with regard to an action is bondage. In fact, the Upanishad says that even the desires to obtain mystic powers like the Ashtasiddhis is bondage. The Ashtasiddhis are supernatural abilities, but material abilities. The Upanishad in itself is not stating something pessimistic about these bondages. At least one should remember that these are the ties that bring one back, and one must not be attached to these ties at the time of death. Moksha, liberation, says the Upanishad, is when one understands the perishable and the imperishable, when one understands the difference between what is temporary and what is eternal. That way, the person no longer desires the material realm, and all the ties to samsara, the cycle of birth and death, are severed. By the way, according to texts like the Jivan Mukti Viveka, there are various types of these liberation. Even when one is not able to attain Jivan Mukti, the highest form of liberation when living, they can still get liberation or at the least advance towards it if they depart without desires and bondages that make them come back. Now, the next two questions are: who is to be honored as a teacher? Who is the student? One who understands the Supreme Absolute and leads seekers towards the Supreme Absolute is the Guru. As for who is the student, a student is one who has attained the true knowledge of the all pervading Brahman, one who has removed the illusions that keep one stuck in the material world. Both of them, of course, the Upanishad states, are part of the Brahman. The next two questions are: who is learned and who is a fool? Again, the Upanishad is a bit unsparing in its answer. It states that anyone who understands the nature of the all-pervading reality, the infinite absolute, is learned. Anyone who operates under the ego and is engrossed in the material, thinking that this world is all that exists, is a fool. The Upanishad is very direct and there are no shortcuts or ifs and buts in this. The next question is very interesting. It is Kim Asuram. This translates to what is Asura, not who, but what. Now, we've seen about Asuras in the Puranic narratives, like the demigods, the Devas. They too are the descendants of the daughters of Daksa, who is the mind-born son of Brahma. Sometimes, people refer to Asuras as demonic beings, but that is not entirely correct, and we'll look at it in another longer discussion. The word Asura itself translates to something that stands in opposition to the Suras, godly nature. The Upanishad here clearly states that Asura is any austerity that is undertaken to attain powers and opulences of Vishnu, Rudra and Brahma. Austerities that are fueled by hatred and violence are asuric in nature. When the Upanishad talks about Vishnu, Rudra and Brahma, what it means is that when one wants to possess the power of creation and dissolution, and they are fueled by hatred to possess this power, any austerity that they do is asuric in nature. These actually trouble the infinite consciousness and, in other words, brings it down to a baser level. The next question that the Upanishad asks is: what is tapas, penance? Tapas, states the Upanishad, is the understanding that the Supreme Absolute, the Brahman alone, is the only truth, and by this knowledge destroys the desires for material powers. The next question: what is the Supreme Abode? Kim Paramam Padam. The Supreme Abode is the abode of the Brahman, which is in the state of pure consciousness bliss. It is far removed from the senses and it is one of eternal freedom. The next two questions are: what is to be realized? What is to be rejected? The Supreme Absolute Infinite Consciousness, unbounded by space, time or substance, is that to be realized. The thought that this material world is all that there is, and the world is distinct from the self, external to the self, are thoughts that should be rejected. The next and the final question that the Upanishad asks is: who is a sannyasin, a renunciate? A person who is free of ego and false sense of possession. A person who has abandoned all, even the worldly duties, who takes refuge in the realization of the Supreme Absolute. He alone is fit to be called a sannyasin. The Upanishad states that such a person wanders about in nirvikalpa samadhi, attaining it by the contemplation of verses such as Tattvamasi, thou art that, and Sarvam khalvidam Brahma. All this is verily Brahman. Such a person, the Upanishad says, is fit to be called a yogi, a true ascetic, and a true Brahman. A Brahman actually means a seeker of Brahman. Now, the word nirvikalpa means unwavering or fixed. Vikalpa means distinction and nirvikalpa means free of distinctions or differences. Nirvikalpa samadhi is a state in which the I vanishes and all that remains is the infinite consciousness bliss. the seeker and the sought becomes one. In the next stage, the renunciate can attain Jivan Mukti, liberation when living. After providing answers for all these questions, the Upanishad concludes with this verse. Whoever learns the Niralamba Upanishad by the grace of a guru becomes pure like fire. He becomes pure like air. He does not return. He does not return. He is not born again. He is not born again. With this, we conclude the discussion on the Niralamba Upanishad. As always, the known is a drop and the unknown an ocean. Peace.